development should be attained through massive project, much more of a Soviet vision of how you revolutionized a society. And Ortega seems to be stuck in that idea. I mean, he has this self-image of a messiah who wants to inherit the country with a mega project, something that will, give him people to remember him. He has not been able to do so. During the 1980s, the Cuban government was facing a lot of crisis. Nicaragua arrived late to the times in which the Soviet Union was spending money all over the place. The Soviet Union was also never helped, with the exception of $12 billion in military aid during the 10 years. Nicaragua didn't receive any concrete mega projects, and I think that's a pressure he has. That's one point. And the other point is that it's not only Ortega pursuing such projects. If you see, the previous conservative governments have done the same, but through the way of requesting assistance to the World Bank and the IMF. And these institutions have not allowed Nicaragua to access such funds until Nicaragua reaches a certain state of development. So I think he also wants to send a message to institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, like saying, hey guys, I can get the money from other sources. And probably those are the two motivations. Of course, there's viability of the projects. I mean, the projects are exciting for the common Nicaraguan, but I think that it's a risky approach.
Farideh?
I cannot tell. That's a difficult question to answer. But if you force me to bet, I would say that chances of Iran coming through are very small. That doesn't mean that Iran will not spend or may not, offer help in some smaller projects. But in terms of these mega projects, I think it's a combination of coordination both with Venezuela, that, given the kind of pressures that exist now in relationship to Chavez, makes it less likely. And I think, secondly, the kind of pressures that Ahmadinejad is facing inside Iran also makes it less likely. It is my understanding that Ortega is trying to use this as a means to interest others in these kind of projects in Nicaragua. And for the life of me, I really don't understand why United States, which can very easily supplant Iran in terms of economic aid to Nicaragua or help, does not do so. But ultimately, if the question is what is my bet about Iran coming through, I would say that I'm not extremely positive.
Yes, please. Yeah, just wait for the mic. I'm going to move the left here. Evita, here. Going to move left, right, middle.
Well, all the panelists kind of, one of the bases for the relationship between Iran and Latin America was more ideological than pragmatic, and it had to do with confrontation with the U.S. And Farideh was mentioning that it's going to go away after Ahmadinejad, or Felix was talking about the problems. But what if the confrontation goes more intense? Like any attack, what do you imagine that scenario if the confrontation between U.S. and Iran becomes more and more intense, which is kind of plausible?
Hugo, would you like to start, and then we move to?
Yeah, what I can say is, from the Argentine government's perspective, they are quite cautious about that. The Argentine government, what it fears is that the request of bringing the Iranian officers to court in Argentina could generate like a casus belli, or an excuse for the U.S. to attack Iran. So Argentina is moving around now, like sensing the waters first, and trying to get help from the international community, but at the same time trying not to push too much the agenda just to be the excuse to something bigger.
Ben?
Well, I think that in the case of Nicaragua, the the capabilities of our country to be involved in such an international conflict are absolutely new. I mean, the Nicaraguan military budget is not even $40 million a year, so that gives you an idea. Our soldiers are basically struggling for their salary each day, and I don't think that, I mean, that will move more than rhetoric. In Venezuela, it's different. If you looked into the fundamentals of Latin American revolution, in order to be regarded as a leader of a revolution, you have to have certain battles, in your record. That is not Chavez's case. It's very strange because, I mean, you have all these former combatants, some of them, with a long history of fighting the so-called revolution, and then you have Chavez, who has never fought a single battle. So I think that psychologically he needs something to probably get the credit or get the credentials as a revolutionary. So it's just a personal speculation, but I think that only Venezuela would be probably a country that in such a hypothesis, and probably we're pushing this too far in terms of scenarios, but will be the only Latin American country that will do something, about it. Other than that, I don't think escape is put.
People who are concerned about the relationship between among the axis of unity, and we are not talking about Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina, or Chile, or whatever, are concerned essentially because they make an argument that Iranian presence in Latin America opens the way for the possibility of terrorist action. So this is why people are concerned, for example, about relaxation of visa to Iranians in Nicaragua, and of course the establishment of an embassy in Nicaragua. From my point of view, if there is a confrontation with actual military confrontation, the Iranians presumably have other easier to access instruments to use against American establishments throughout the world. So that argument has never been very convincing to me. The military component of the relationship between Iran and the so-called axis of unity, as was mentioned, is effectively nil. I mean, obviously, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador, there is nothing there to be even to discuss. And Venezuelan military relationship, from my understanding, is essentially has nothing to do with Iran. Their relationship has nothing to do with military component. Venezuela is getting its arms from Russia, effectively, and other countries, not that relationship. So, in the case of conflict, obviously, Iran will have allies in Latin America who will complain at international fora about United States action. But in terms of what that offers as a resource to Iran, obviously there is nothing there. And that is obviously noted inside Iran when the criticism comes for Ahmadinejad's foreign policy in Latin America. That this relationship beyond some rhetorical aspect really does not offer anything in terms of Iran's defense in these difficult times.
Yes, just wait for the microphone and identify yourself, please.
Thank you. I'm Douglas Farah. I was wondering, particularly for Felix, if in Nicaragua, I've heard that in Venezuela a lot of times the Iranians obligate the women to leave the ministry buildings when they're there meeting with Venezuelan officials. Is this also happening in Nicaragua? Do you know? And do you know if there's any other group that's following the implementation of the Iranian promises in Bolivia, Ecuador, or elsewhere, to see if they're doing the same thing in Nicaragua or elsewhere as they're seeming not doing in Nicaragua? And also, I was wondering for both Hugo and Felix, if there are counter measures in place in the democratic system, in the Asamblea, for example, that will allow more transparency into the Iranian relationship, be able to force Ortega to open up more on that. And as you were mentioning with the gentleman who had criticized the Argentine judicial system and came back, that is now back on public stage, is there enough internal control or mechanisms internally in the democratic system to deal with those people, marginalize them again, or allow them to be rehabilitated, or is the process corrupted enough so that basically the presidents can do what they want without a lot of checks and balances?
Thank you.
Okay, very interesting question. In fact, Ortega, when he was in the opposition, before he became president, he tried to present himself as a very progressive leader, someone who will, pursue some very liberal causes. In 1998, there was a major scandal. His daughter-in-law accused him of rape. She said that she had been used as a sex slave since she was 11. So that caused that Ortega lost all the support of the feminist group within the Sandinista movement, which is what was the most important feminist movement in Nicaragua. So the feminist movement has become very anti-Ortega over the years, and Ortega responded in a way that it's very, very hard to understand. He became very conservative, and he became an ally of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Obando, who was one of the main leaders of the opposition during the 1980s, is today one of Ortega's closer allies, and they have been working together to present Ortega as almost this semi-Catholic priest, and so on. So one of the first things he did when he became president was to support the elimination of therapeutic abortion. So Nicaragua is only one of 3 countries in the world that prohibits women to pursue therapeutic abortion under any condition, and any doctor who will intervene will be put in prison. So I don't think that it's now that we know that, it's very it's not a scandal being Ortega, so close to a regime that is very conservative, because I've read other reactions to, for example, the relationship between Iran and Bolivia with a government of indigenous inspiration who pursues very, very progressive causes. In the case of Ortega, he's a Marxist only on his speech. If you look into local, politics, he's becoming very conservative in terms of so-called moral issues, which is a huge contradiction. In his recent trip to Iran, Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, decided, and I'm sorry for my ignorance, how do you call the
Just put a scarf on
the
her.
scarf, okay, the scarf. I wanted to use the proper word, which caused a lot of humor within political circles, because she's, so very, very progressive. In the issue of transparency, this allows me to add to Cynthia's question on mega projects and getting the funds from the other source. If Ortega gets the sources from, let's say, the World Bank and so on, there's plenty of institutional mechanisms to use the money. That is not the case with the cooperation from Venezuela, around $520 million a year that are being used outside the budget without any control whatsoever from the Comptroller General's office and so on. So I think that probably that's another incentive to pursue cooperation from Iran. For some reason, Ortega has been able to devise a mechanism to use cooperation under the table. And yes, there is already a national movement pushing for transparency. The small party that I mentioned, it also has been joined by other political parties. They already filed a complaint with the authorities to force Ortega to reveal information on these documents.
Yeah.
In the case of that former public officer, Luis Delia, he's not now on the government, but he's becoming like fuerza de choque. He's a not paramilitary, but an informal force to push on the street against the protesters, for instance. So every time he appears on TV or on radio or something, he's so polarizing that he usually generates just the opposite of what the government wants. So actually last time he appeared on TV, he punched on the nose to a protester, and he generated that there were more protests in the street. So for the government, it's a dual way of dealing with him. Is they won't be calling him to office again, but they will use him and call him every time they think they're going to be using him.
Yes,
Can I
please.
say something? No? No? Okay.
Sorry.
I
Yes. And the whole list of
Thank you. I'm Les Simon, a former scholar here at the Wilson Center, and my question is mostly for Farideh. It's a follow-up to the earlier question about a military relationship. Back in the at the very beginning of the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro had an axis of annoyance, and both enjoyed poking the United States in the eye. And unfortunately, it escalated over a few years. And it ended with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was as serious as things get. Yesterday or the day before, the Iranians tested missiles with a 1,200-mile range that can be augmented to much further. In today's world, it's much more difficult to covertly move missiles around and install them. Ahmadinejad, in his dreams at night, must think how wonderful it might be to place some missiles in Venezuela that could hit the southern half of the United States. Are they as reckless as that, or do you think that's something we just don't need to worry about at all?
I just think that Iran is just not, to sort of make comparisons between Iran and Soviet Union is just not a correct comparison. It's a question of scale. I mean, there has been talks. The Colombian foreign minister talked about a bike factory in Venezuela being a place where suspicious nuclear activities are going on. So, and of course, immediately, Colombian president retracted the statement 2 days later. And Ahmadinejad and Chavez joke about that. He says, we are making atomic bombs, atomic bikes in Venezuela. And Chavez, whenever he goes to Iran, he says, I'm coming here to get the bomb. But they do so publicly, and they poke fun of. It's just, talking about scale. Iranian military spending is of such low magnitude in comparison to what is going on at the world scale, and the kind of news that is around the Iranian neck. People just have to be reminded constantly that Iran is a developing country. It's not a superpower by any means, and that kind of grandiose scale of things that people imagine is simply out of the reach of Iranian economic, political, and military system. Now we may want to work on that idea for political purposes, politics of fear in the United States, but then there is this reality that Iran is basically a, developing country that is seeking a degree of regional influence. And it may be successful in doing that, and nobody denies that, but beyond that, I think, is our imagination as opposed to Ahmadinejad's active imagination.
Yes, please.
Jerry Olick, retired intelligence officer. My question goes along with what was just discussed, is politics of fear. I came here because I looked at the title and it was threat or annoyance. And I'm trying to understand everything I've heard, I hear annoyance and poking the eye. So what would constitute a threat? Not imaginary, but or overstated, but is the cooperation on the oil question a strategic threat? What do the panelists think would constitute a threat from Iran in Latin America?
Who wants to go first? Okay.
Personally, I don't see from Nicaragua any relevant threat whatsoever. Although we have to take note of what the Sandinista government did at some point, not with, I must clarify, with a state actor, but with non-state actor. The bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center, the guys had Nicaraguan passports, and Nicaragua distributed at that point 1,500 passports to the PLO. So I don't think that Ortega is, will take the risk that he used to take back in the 1980s. But as an intelligence officer, you know that when you have a guy whose mental stability you can question, I mean, you can speculate onto what.
I think since we have a number of questions, I'm just going to let one of the panelists answer the question so that if there is time at the end, I will then call on I have everybody's name down. Yes, I know that. The lady here. Yes.
I'm Dina Siegel-Van. I'm with the American Jewish Committee. And I wanted to go back to what Felix mentioned about the schizophrenia that the Nicaraguan government is experiencing. And I think that it's a pattern that we're seeing around the region. I think that there's a schizophrenia. On one hand, I think there's fear, of course, based on the attacks in the 90s, even though there's still suspicion about what really went on. But I think that by now everybody knows that Iran was very much involved with Hezbollah's help. So on one hand, there's fear. On the other hand, of course, there's lots of trade going on in Uruguay, in Brazil, in many other places. We know that it's growing. And of course, all these pledges that are still to be fulfilled. But my question is, and again, maybe pressing Farideh, I'm not sure that I agree with the fact that, even though Iran is a country that is developing and is not the same thing as the Soviet Union, that you can dispel, the potential danger that is in the region while the countries solve their schizophrenia through psychoanalysis or however they want to solve it, you're seeing increasingly, people coming from Iran and from Syria into the region with very, you don't know exactly who's coming in these flights.
A question, please.
Yes. No, I'm just wanting to know the assessment. I just want to say that there's lots of things that are happening in terms of these visas, these trips to the region without visas from all kinds of people. The fact that, you have these flights that nobody knows from Caracas, Damascus, Tehran on a weekly basis, and nobody knows what's on those flights. I mean, the fact that we've seen non-state actors, in the region undertaking some very negative actions. How can you assess and say, Iran or dispel any fears about the potential for something much worse happening?
Okay, the question that was previously asked was about deployment of missiles in Venezuela, and that was my response to that was essentially that the comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis is not a justified comparison. So we were not talking about the question of terrorism and non-state actors, presumably in Latin America. Now, clearly, the history that exists in Latin America in relationship, in particular in Argentina, has created tremendous amount of concern and the border regions. Now, precisely because the Argentinian case has not been resolved, Kirchner calls the Argentinian case the national disgrace in 2006. And precisely because it's not clear who was involved. You suggested that it's pretty well established that the Iranians did it. It is not, okay? We don't even know. There is even debate about whether or not this was a car bomb or not. There is even a big issue in terms of, and of course, the way it has been handled, it's been so disastrous. You know that the Iranian ambassador in England was actually arrested and in jail for a good period of time, and Argentina was unable to give enough evidence to the British judge to extradite him to Argentina. So the Argentinian case has been a disastrous case. And of course, we have all these discussions about people coming and going, and with the regular flights between Iran and Venezuela on a weekly basis, those have become, reconfirmed or whatever. I am not in a position, or anybody in this room to say Iranians have no malintentions in the world, okay? A negative is impossible to prove, okay? But in order for me, as a person that has some common sense, and when you give me some evidence, I use my common sense to make an intelligent argument, you have to give me some evidence, something. You can't say there are flights from Iran to Nicaragua, therefore there is to Venezuela. Who are these people? Therefore they are suspicious. I mean, Iran has a car factory, has major investments in Venezuela. If you give me some evidence that I can use my common sense, to assess, I'm perfectly happy to assess that evidence and make an argument. So far as I can tell, and I do not read Spanish, okay, but I do keep, for example, in the Argentinian case, I have kept a very close watch in terms of what is available in English and France. And it's a mess. It's a mess. It tells me a lot more about how corrupt the Argentinian justice system is than what the Iranian may or may have not done in Argentina. And therefore, my answer to you is that no, I cannot say that the Iranians do not have malintentions, but that's an argument that is, you can never scientifically deny something that is, negative. But does that turn into something that is any more significant than what the Iranians are doing anywhere else? I don't see it.
Yes, without entering in a confrontation with my colleague, what I'm going to just say is for the countries of Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and so many other countries that deal with Iran like they deal now, is that given what happened in Argentina in the 80s, when we had all those kind of contracts, arrangements, pacts and treaties and everything else with Iran, and what happened in the 90s is if you're going to review your agreements with Iran, watch your back.
Thank you. In the back. Yes. And then the middle, and then we move to the front again.
Oh, hello, I'm James Offlam from the Israel Project. I know the last comments might put a bit of debate upon the terrorist attacks in Argentina, but I just wanted to ask a question. As Hugo said, most of the evidence seems to point to Iran, and with the issue of the international arrest warrants for high-ranking Iranian officials. Firstly, do you think, how do you see the issue being resolved if it's going to get resolved? And do you think there's enough sort of international political will for the perpetrators to be eventually brought to justice?
What I think is, you got to remember what Argentina is. It's a middle-income country, a developing country from southern South America, the end of the world. And what do the U.S. do in that situation? They would strike. What can Argentina do? Wait. So Argentina, what it has to do is to try to push for its agenda, to try to request the international help, try to deal with its own problem. Like she said, we have huge corruption problems in the judiciary system. That is absolutely true. But it's also true that the evidence that it was reaffirmed by Interpol in 2007 requested the extradition and released the red notices of Interpol to try to detain Iranian people, Iranian former officers, Iranian former diplomats that are suspected to be part or responsible of the bombing of 94, for instance. But for instance, what can Argentina do? Can actually try to find them? Remember, Argentina is like Venezuela, like New Zealand. What would happen if a bombing happens in New Zealand? What is New Zealand going to do against Iran? What can it do? It's going to try to do what it can. And so that's what is going on right now. Of course, Argentina is quite sensitive, like I said before, to the idea of giving an excuse for the U.S. to strike in Iran. So for Argentina, when the White House expressed its full support for Argentina against Iran, is low. Is that good or is that worse? No, it's like, thank you very much. Now I'm gonna go for Interpol. Thank you, and the United Nations. So it's that situation.
Yeah. I've 4 people and just 8 minutes, so I would like the questions to be very brief and ask my panelist colleague to be also brief in their answers so I can call on everyone. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Tarek Rashidi. I'm from the IRC. You talked a lot about Iran's political and economic intentions in Latin America. Do you see Iranian, clerics or any sort of the religious leaders pushing a religious agenda, especially amongst, say, pockets of Shia within Latin America or other groups that it may see as sort of receptive to those ideas?
Okay. But who wants to take? Anybody? Farideh, do you see any push for conversion?
No push for conversion, but certainly an attempt to have some sort of influence. There is relationship, but there are mosques being built in Venezuela. So there is an attempt to, service the population that is there. But, there is a fundamental contradiction, as was pointed out, referred to originally in terms of the relationship that some of these leftist governments of Latin America are striking with a fundamentalist religious regime in Iran. And that fundamental contradiction was revealed when the daughter and son of Che Guevara visited Iran, and they gave a speech. And in the process of giving a speech, the minister of religious guidance in Iran, cultural Islamic guidance, started talking about the importance of religion. And Che Guevara's daughter had to be very clear that this is not what Che's legacy was about. And that created a big kerfuffle in Iran, and she had to be censored, So that fundamental contradiction is something that will work out or will play out constantly in terms of the relationship to those particular countries. But Iran is very much interested. I mean, there is a huge mosque in Buenos Aires. There is a Muslim population. The Iranian embassy is very active in developing relationship with those communities. But extending beyond those communities, I haven't seen anything.
Marco, you pass?
It was answered.
Okay. Then, gentleman in the back in the white shirt. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Alan Goldsmith. I'm from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs staff. I just wanted to ask. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to talk or to ask about how Hezbollah in Syria may have been piggybacking off of the increased ties between Iran and these Latin American countries, and if you could just talk about that increased Syrian economic, political involvement in the region, and also possible increased Hezbollah presence as well. Thank you.
Felix, do you want to take that?
What I can say is, again, remind you about the tri-border area in which there are regular suspicious about sales, financing areas, sham companies and all that stuff. And there were also some, warning signs in Iquique, Chile, and around Curaçao in Brazil. There were some, strange activities going around there that the U.S. government pay attention to, and I'm aware of that because American sources are telling me that. And actually, those are 3 focus that they are interested right now.
Farideh?
I don't have. I mean, there have always been talks. Menem, after all, comes from a Syrian background. So in Argentina, there is always talk about that connection. But I have not seen any discussion of spiked activities beyond what has already been discussed in the past few years, couple of years, since Ahmadinejad has come to power.
Just 30 seconds to each of the panelists. Is it an axis of annoyance or not? Let's start with you.
I will go with the hypothesis of annoyance, definitely.
Me too, but I would also remind you about the eventuality of a threat, one, and two is that for many countries in Latin America, I believe that is a matter of getting money. You got to remind that in Latin America, how many foreign investors are willing to invest when you don't have a rule of law, when there are corruption practices, and so for some governments in Latin America is who has the money, who can have the money. So another country that we didn't mention here that is also a major issue in Latin America is China. China is willing to pay. China is willing to invest. So no matter if it's a communist country or not, come over. Let's talk.
Yeah, I'm sure my colleague in the Latin America program will do very soon something on China and Latin America if they haven't done it. So, yeah. Okay, Farideh.
Well, with the particular countries, the few countries that we're talking about, certainly an axis of annoyance. But I think that axis of annoyance should not be lead us to not take into account more important relationships that are being struck in Latin America between Iran, for example, and Brazil. And Iran and Mexico. These relationships will be long-standing relationships. Brazil has the much more active Brazilian-Iranian Chamber of Commerce than Venezuela has in Iran. These relationships should not be ignored either.
I'd like to thank the panelists and also all of you to be here. We are taking a 15-minute break, and we start the next panel at 11:15 sharp. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Un honor compartir el panel con vos. Un placer.